You're listening to the Future Tech Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Future technologies such as artificial intelligence, stem cells, 3D printing, gene editing, Bitcoin, blockchain, the microbiome, quantum computing, virtual reality, and exploring space are much closer than you might think. In fact, many early versions of these technologies are in play right now, and the companies that are using these technologies are the focus of this podcast. My goal for you, the listener, is to learn from these podcasts. You may very well learn something that may change the course of your life for the better, steer you towards a new career, or give you insight into addressing a thorny medical problem. Remember, this podcast and its content is informational in nature only. No medical, tax, legal, financial, or psychological advice is being given. If you've enjoyed the podcast, please listen, subscribe, like, and tell your friends about it. Thank you. Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Future Tech and Future Tech Health podcast, and I have a returning guest, Paul Ehrlich, a famous guy. He's been around for a long time. He wrote a book called The Population Bomb, I believe in '68. Is that right, Paul?
That's right.
Okay. Yeah,
I was only 2 years old. That's an important thing to point out.
I was -7, so yeah, it was a big accomplishment. Last time I know, like I said, we talked about the epidemic of recessed jaws and smaller mouths, but this is a totally different topic. So, I know this book was written a long time ago, but I'm sure this is something you thought about your whole life, the population explosion, and you've now witnessed what's happened over the past, 40 some odd years. So that's what I wanted to ask you. What prompted you back in '68 to write the book? And then I'd like to go through what's happened since and what your thoughts are.
Well, first of all, the thing that stimulated me to write the book back then was even then it was crystal clear that our environmental problems, which were becoming much more talked about because of Silent Spring, that the one element that was not being discussed at all, and one of the main causative elements in it was human overpopulation. And I can't say that anything's changed very much. I have been working very hard the last few days with a group of scientists who are trying to get an article out pointing out once again that people are utterly ignoring the role that population size and growth has in cooking our future. So nothing much has changed. It's only been 50 years, but what the hell?
What were some of your predictions back in '68? And then now that you look back upon them, how do you...
Well, we predicted that the climate would change in part in response to the growth of the human population. And of course, it has changed and is changing rapidly and now threatening our very existence. We predicted that one of the lines in the book that was most attacked was near the front. I think it was actually on the front page, which said the battle to feed all of humanity is over. And everybody said, that's nonsense. We're going to all become vegetarians. We're going to eat whales that are farmed in atolls and so on and so forth. And it turns out that today there's something on the order of 800 million people starving and another 2 billion with inadequate diets. But that hasn't affected the people keep saying the same stuff. Population doesn't make any difference. And of course, to anybody with an IQ of over 30, you can see immediately it makes a huge difference. How we affect our resources, each other, our planet is a function both of how many of us there are and how each of us behaves. And you put them together, for example, if each individual is beginning on average to consume more and you have more and more people, then guess what? Since aggregate consumption is the main impact we have on our environment, our impact keeps increasing. And you don't have to be very bright to realize you cannot grow forever on a finite planet. Just can't be done. Of course, Jeff Bezos understands that we'll just go off and live on satellites, which I think is a great plan.
The narrative seems to be, the population has grown tremendously, but now the growth is slowing. Is that what you see? And do you think we'll get to a status where we've stopped growing, where we get to, let's say, 10 billion or 11 billion? Or do you think
without question, we'll get to a status when we're not growing. No scientist would dispute that. The question is what the size will be when we stop growing. Is it going to be, we have pushing a billion people today. When Ann and I wrote The Population Bomb in '68, there were about 3.5 billion. So we're more than twice as many people today. The sustainable number in the long run is probably somewhere around 1 billion, the long run being a few centuries. And so the issue is, can we get back down from 7.5 billion to somewhere in the vicinity of 1 to 3 billion over the next few centuries? And the answer is almost certainly we'll get there. The issue is, do we get there by dramatically reducing our birth rate, or do we get there by having Earth dramatically increase our death rate? And that's not clear at the moment, although all the odds seem to be in favor of increasing the death rate. There is no choice. It's got to be one or the other.
Okay. How did you come to that calculation between 1 and 3 billion? Like, what goes into figuring that out?
Well, I did it with several colleagues, and it was probably 25 years ago now. But we asked the following question. If you want to have an optimum population on the planet, how many can you support where you would have big cities where people who like to have opera and good restaurants, and also wilderness where you have people could live with nature and be hermits, and assuming something like the then available technologies, how many likely could you support in those conditions? And it came out to be about a little over a billion people. And just to be safe, you might support 2 or 3 billion, but to be safe, keep it below the grand total. And that was about the number of people we had at the turn of the 20th century, around 1900, when there were big cities and industry and also a lot of wilderness.
Well, what about technologies that have come about, like the Haber-Bosch process to?
Well, yeah, some of the technologies have at least temporarily expanded, for example, our food supply, although for example, the extra nitrogen in the environment from the Haber-Bosch process is not a very good thing. We have dramatically changed, as we discussed last time, the kind of food we produce, and that is having a whole series of negative aspects on humanity. We are, among other things, getting fatter, getting more diabetes, getting more heart disease, and so on. And that has its effects on us. But the main thing right now, there are two or three things that our technologies are doing to us, which are very, very dangerous. First of all, of course, there's the adding of greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. And the more people you have, the more greenhouse gases go into the atmosphere. As a matter of fact, the food system itself contributes something on the order of 1/3 of the greenhouse gases that go into the atmosphere. So the more people you have, the more food you need to produce, the more greenhouse gases go into the atmosphere, the more the climate is disrupted. And of course, food production is directly and intimately connected to the climate. So the very process of getting ourselves more food is also a process of disrupting the climate and hindering the amount of decent food we can get. I mean, for example, just adding carbon dioxide to the atmosphere reduces the nutritional value of our main grain crops. So we're very busily sawing off the limb we're sitting on, and people have not yet learned a very, very basic fact of arithmetic. That is, a long history of exponential growth in no way implies a long future of that kind of growth.
Yeah, I guess all exponentially growing systems, will reach a point where the entire system changes dramatically.
Exactly.
So what level of awareness do you believe there is of what's going on, amongst various groups, scientists, politicians, the average person?
The awareness in the scientific community is very high. There have been a whole series of warnings published by the scientific community and paid no attention to by the mass media. For example, I think it was in 1993, all the scientific academies of the world got together and said, if you keep the population growing, we're screwed. And nobody paid the slightest attention. The New York Times didn't even notice it. Neither did the Washington Post and most major journals around the world. The mainstream media just ignored it. It was seconded about a year ago. The first time was several hundred scientists. The second time it was 15,000 scientists and growing today. But nobody's paying any attention. They think the big problem in the world is Trump. Of course, having the country and the world run by a bunch of thugs is not an ideal way to solve these gigantic problems, but that's what we're trying to do, and ignorant thugs on top of it. So we're turning the world over to the losers. They're running the world, and they're running it into the ground for the profit of themselves and their families and their supporters. There's no complexity in it. You were talking about corruption last time. Well, boy, do we see it now. Excuse me, that's not a political view. It's a scientific view.
Yeah, no problem. What do you think of the efforts being made to curb global warming? The Paris Accords, caps on emissions.
Well, there was a point on a lot of issues that have interested me for my entire life when I thought we were making real progress. I mean, for example, in Richard Nixon's day, Richard Nixon had his flaws, but he was a very clever politician, and he realized the world was getting into trouble, and some of the best environmental legislation started out pushed by Republicans in the Nixon days. Then along came Ronald Reagan, reversed the whole thing. You think Trump was the worst president we've ever had, but in terms of ending our civilization, Reagan may have had a larger impact by reversing our environmental things. And of course, we have now the Republican war on women, when we have a desperate situation where we should be doing everything we can to lower birth rates, and where everybody knows that the very best, most humane thing you can do to start out lowering birth rates is to give full rights to women. And what are we doing? We have a bunch of thugs trying to take away the rights of women. So, how can one be cheery in those circumstances?
Well, okay. What do you think of the current efforts to stem climate change in particular? Do you think that they're have any hope of being effective, even with full participation of all countries in the world, or do you think that they're just not even close to the goals we need? Because all the climate goals never talk about population; they just talk about getting us to a sustainable level. But I've never really heard any of them talk about the population would have to come down in order to reach sustainability.
That's what's depressing.
It seems like it is what it is.
Yeah, that's what's so depressing is that none of the things, first of all, even with the assumption that we can continue to grow and the technologies will allow us to reduce the amount of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases flowing into the atmosphere, that we can meet our goals and keep the climate relatively stable and livable. Well, there's no real scientific support for the idea that 2 degrees Celsius rise in temperature is safe. It may or may not be. We don't know enough about the system, but there's more and more stuff coming out all the time. A very brilliant research report from Australia pointing out what all of us have known for a long time, that the IPCC is intrinsically very conservative. In my view, for example, statements like, we have a 1 in 3 chance of keeping the temperature below, say, 2 degrees Celsius increase. Well, a 1 in 3 chance is like if somebody told you there's a 1 in 3 chance you won't have a bullet in your brain in the next hour, you wouldn't consider that a very conservative estimate. And all the information that's coming out makes it look, even under current assumptions, which are not being met, current assumptions, for instance, of the Paris Accords, are not likely to get us there, or at least are not certain. to get us there. And there are huge numbers of things, feedbacks and so on, that aren't being properly considered. So it's a tough shot, even if we started tomorrow to try and do the right things. I have serious doubts personally, and many other scientists have doubts too, that we'll avoid a really catastrophic climate situation. And that's only one bit of it, because, of course, it's interacting with the destruction of biodiversity, which are the life support systems that we absolutely need if we're going to continue to live on the planet. And the loss of biodiversity, the UN recently came out and said 1 million animals are at risk. It isn't the 1 million animals we care about. It's the ecological systems made up of all those animals and plants and microorganisms that support our lives. They are suffering from climate disruption already. They're also being wiped out for many other reasons. And without them, we're not going to be able to do some of the things we really care to do, like eat. Most of our most nutritious crops are pollinated for us by insects, and the insects are disappearing.
So how come you haven't done an update to the book? How come it's been 50 years and there's been no update?
Oh, we've written about 5 other books that update it, but nobody pays any attention. And again, there's nothing. It's not just what we say. I say the scientific community is saying it repeatedly. There's something right now like 20 warnings from science about the things that are going on that need to be stopped, and nobody's paying any attention to them. The 1993 statement of all the academies, the 1993, I think it was, also world scientists warning to humanity. The updates of those in recent years have gotten no mass media attention at all. I have yet to hear. The only thing that's come up in the current political situation is climate disruption, because we're beginning to see the effects there so dramatically that Trump can lie his head off, but it's not going to, people are going to be able to duck the tornadoes on their own. And in many places, they're going to be doing without water. And whatever Trump says, it's not going to make climate change a hoax, So we actually have one candidate, I believe, among the Democrats who's making climate disruption. His major is Jay Inslee, I think his name is. And he's making climate change his major thing. Well, why should somebody make his major thing the thing most likely to end our civilization in the next 20 years? I mean, why should we deal with that when we have important things like how many lies Trump told in the last 15 minutes?
So what do you think is the window on which you're going to see dramatic changes, and what will the changes be?
We're seeing it right now. We're seeing it in the weird weather, the continual tornadoes and so on in the Midwest, the lengthening droughts and heat waves. We're into it already. And of course, you and I aren't, and most of our listeners aren't. But if you were living in the city that used to be called Madras in India, you find that your water has to be delivered and locked up if you can afford it, because the drought is so bad. And people are starting to go hungry in various parts of the world, and that's going to spread. One of the things we predicted years and years and years ago, wrote an entire book on it, is the refugee crisis that's going to become worse and worse. What are we having now in the United States? A long, stupid debate on immigration policy without any debate at all on population policy. The people on both sides of the immigration story are totally ignorant of the causes, consequences, and likely future of this. We're seeing the bare edge of a start of what's going to happen as the population expands, particularly in Africa, and as the population expands and people begin to move to get reasonable conditions. In other words, we're seeing now people flooding towards the United States and flooding towards Europe, because parts of the world are already into the collapse mode, and it's going to get much, 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 much worse.
So what would be, if you were able to make policy and enforce it, what would be some of the prescriptions that you'd write for now?
Well, the prescriptions I would write for now, deal with the major elements. First of all, we do know that we can change our consumption patterns very rapidly. We know that from the history, for instance, of the Second World War, when on December 7th, 1942, the United States had produced something like 4 million automobiles. Then the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, and we didn't produce any more automobiles for about 4 years. We produced, hundreds of thousands of tanks, half-tracks, jeeps, and so on. We rationed gasoline. We rationed meat. I can remember picking milkweed pods in the East in the summer because you could give the fluff inside. There were places that collected it for making life jackets for the Navy and so on. Consumption patterns can be changed very, very rapidly, as they were in all the nations that went to war in the Second World War. We can only change reproductive patterns humanely slowly. And that means doing things exactly the opposite of what many of the Republican legislators and governors in the United States are doing now. That is giving more rights, more opportunities, equal pay, equal opportunity to women everywhere. And we know from history that the better you treat women, the fewer extra babies they want to have. So that's one of the things that I would work on very, very hard while I was dealing with the gross economic inequities that cause people to rush towards the places where there's still some work, some food, some safety, which are getting to be fewer and fewer. So if you don't deal with the population side, eventually that gets you for sure. Consumption you can deal with rapidly, but it takes political will to do it. Equity issues, particularly economic equity issues, racial equity, gender equity, and so on, all are critical to this. If you're going to get people to be willing to cooperate, you got to give people, some reasonable way to see themselves improving their lives and surviving, and you've got to tackle those. And those are areas where, 25 years ago, I might have said we made a lot of progress. Women's rights, gay rights, racial rights, religious equity, and so on. But now the thugs have turned it around. We have a racist rapist as president, and nobody seems to care. There are 40 million Americans that are willing to vote for that moronic loser. I mean, how can you possibly think there's any hope for the country when there's 40 million people who just don't give a damn?
Okay. So, no, I guess I'm not sure.
Sorry.
To answer you at this point, but no, it's all right.
The article that I'm working on with a bunch of colleagues is scientists have to tell it like it is. There's no point in kidding around about these things. It drives me nuts to hear Democrats saying we've got to hold more hearings to find out whether or not Trump is a person who should be removed from the office he's holding. He's the first president in my lifetime that I thought was so obviously unfit for the office that all you got to do is turn on the TV for 10 minutes and you'd get 3 excuses to impeach the man, and yet the Democrats still want to go slow. If there ever was a person who deserved to be thrown out of the president's office, somebody who's making money by being president, hasn't followed the Constitution at all, and so on, it is just beyond belief. And I don't see any reason to have hope that we're going to start moving in the right direction on anything. I'm right now terrified that there's going to be some kind of a slip in the Middle East, and we're going to have yet another war, one that could turn nuclear. And our own policies on the nuclear front make the dangers of an accidental nuclear war even larger than they were during the Cold War. And that's not my opinion. That's the opinion of people like Bill Perry, who was Clinton's last defense secretary, and so on, John Holdren, who was the Obama's science advisor, and so on. Everybody who understands the nuclear situation is scared witless, and we have 2 morons, one in North Korea and one in the White House, playing nuclear games. I mean, it's enough to make you just want to bury your head in the sand.
So what would be some resources for listeners to find out more about the realities of the current state of things? In addition to podcasts like these, any books or websites?
I particularly don't believe me. I could be a paid agent for the condom industry after all. There's lots and lots of material out there. I can send you some stuff if you want, if you can distribute it, I'll just email you some papers, and people. You can find it almost anywhere. But of course, now you can also find pure crap almost anywhere. And how do you tell them apart? Well, it means a lot of studying. It means a lot of getting your friends and dividing up the world so some of them know some things very well and others know other things very well, and they can help you sort the nonsense from what you really need to know to plan whatever you can in saving yourself and the people you love. It's one of the things I like about the Jaws epidemic is it's one where you actually can do something yourself to maybe make things better. Very difficult on climate disruption, very difficult on the toxics, which we're all now getting loaded with more and more. The microplastics that are now going into our brains, the climate disruption, all these things are very difficult for individuals to deal with, except politically. And if you want to deal with them politically, you got to vote the morons out of office. You got to get people who actually have policies, who understand situations, who are interested in actually studying things and then doing the best possible. Nobody knows what the very best is, but we sure as hell know a lot of things that are better than we're doing now.
Okay. Well, very good. Well, Paul, I appreciate you coming and being very.
Sorry to have depressed you.
No, it's not depressing. I was going to make a joke and say, thanks for your very carefully worded and politically correct statements. And honesty's better. So I appreciate it.
Well, it's been my pleasure. Thank you very much. And if you send me an email, I will email you some stuff.
Will do.
Thank you.
You're listening to the Future Tech Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Future technologies such as artificial intelligence, stem cells, 3D printing, gene editing, Bitcoin, blockchain, the microbiome, quantum computing, virtual reality, and exploring space are much closer than you might think. In fact, many early versions of these technologies are in play right now, and the companies that are using these technologies are the focus of this podcast. My goal for you, the listener, is to learn from these podcasts. You may very well learn something that may change the course of your life for the better, steer you towards a new career, or give you insight into addressing a thorny medical problem. Remember, this podcast and its content is informational in nature only. No medical, tax, legal, financial, or psychological advice is being given. If you enjoyed the podcast, please listen, subscribe, like, and tell your friends about it. Thank you.